Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lift Economy. My guest today is Adrienne Maree Brown. Adrienne is the writer-in-residence at the Emergent Strategy Ideation Institute and author of Grievers, the first novella in a trilogy on the Black Dawn imprint. Holding Change, the way of emergent strategy facilitation and mediation, We Will Not Cancel Us, and Other Dreams of Transformative Justice, Pleasure Activism, The Politics of Feeling Good, Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds, and she's the co-editor of Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction from Social Justice Movements, and How to Get Stupid White Men Out of Office. She is the co-host of the How to Survive the End of the World podcast, Octavia's Parables podcast, and Emergent Strategy podcast. Adrienne is rooted in Detroit. Adrienne, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for having me.
If folks are kind of curious, how did you first get interested in the work you're doing today?
I mean, the work of writing, I think, was from very young, from a very early age. I had a lot to say, and it came through in this way. I think from the time that I could write, I was writing essays, writing monologues, writing, thoughts, like really trying to think things through. And that has carried through all the other work I've done. And then I think the work of social justice for me, it started early. Like I think by the sixth grade, I already had a sense of wanting to push back on things, push back on authority, push back on uniformity. And I got politicized more in college and joined movements, joined communities that were fighting against police brutality, really got informed about the AIDS crisis. There were different things like, the issues that I got pulled into. I think it was maybe my mid-20s or so when it started to all come together, that it's not just this issue, it's not just these people or these people, but it's an entire systemic approach to the world that is based in capitalism and competition and oppression. And when that clicked, it starts to unlock the possibilities of like, well, if this is a system, there could be other systems. And maybe there's systems that predate this and there's systems that'll come after this. And so I think that's then been like a core question of my life is, so what are those other ways of being? And, I look towards nature. I look towards nature a lot, like nature beyond human nature, to understand those things.
I wanted to take time to thank you because last year, you and Autumn, your sister, for folks who don't know, on your podcast, How to Survive the End of the World, read the name of some folks that had passed from COVID. And Autumn asked me if I wanted to submit anyone. And my grandmother, May Bunny Hunter, she actually passed from COVID pretty early days. She was in New Orleans in one of the first not group homes, but
elder homes,
residential care facilities. Yeah, that sort of had the virus. So I just wanted to appreciate you for reading it out.
Wow, Ryan. I'm so sorry for your grandmother loss. My partner's grandmother just died of COVID, and it's so tender. It really shifts it's like there's the theoretical experience, and then there's like, no, it's really intimate. Yeah, I'm sorry for your loss. I love her name. I remember her name.
This sort of dovetails with, you've been a leader in sort of honoring those that we've lost, family and friends and movement community, because the losses have been so unprecedented, really. And in a way, I'm wondering if this dovetails at all with your work I know that Grievers, the book, has been a project for you for many years. I'm curious if you could speak about grief, or maybe just how does the book Grievers relate to sort of this larger piece of, this, where we're at in the world around grief?
Yeah, grief work. Yeah, I mean, the more I sit with, especially having grievers out in the world, because it feels so intimate to have this book in the world. And I'm realizing that intimacy is because it really is an altar for me. Grievers itself is a story, but it's also an altar of people that I've lost. And I think the way that it relates to how we hold grief or don't hold grief is in my early 30s. I'm 43 now. So like in my early 30s, there was a wave of a lot of losses close to me that sparked the fire that would become this story. And I realized no one ever told me exactly what to do with this. Like if you there's certain patterns where it's like, okay, you go to a funeral or you go to a wake or you sit together and tell stories or, there's different practices. But I realized that one of the things, especially for those of us who are displaced from our indigenous lineages, one of the things we lose is clarity on how to honor our dead. I picked up things along the way, and one of them was an ancestor altar practice. And so I've had an ancestor altar in my home for a long time. And when someone would pass, I would light a tea candle, like a little candle, light that candle as soon as I heard about it, with the intention of honoring their life and the light of their life, and also lighting the way, because we don't really know what's beyond. Some say we're moving towards the light. Some say there's a lot of darkness, folks who've come back. And there's just so many different narratives on like, what is that beyond place? But what I always want to say is like, have a good transition, whatever that means, that you don't have to be afraid of this next chapter, even if we are sitting in our loss. I don't want to necessarily assume that for the person who's died, that that's a bad thing or a negative thing. And anyway, so I go through that whole process, and it always helps me. It might just be to help me, but it always helps me to sit and have that moment of like, this doesn't have to be a loss for that person. And we can light a candle to honor everything that they did here. And maybe the place that they've gone to is the most spectacular, outstanding place ever. We don't know. So that process of considering that grief is for those who are left behind, and that the grief is an act of love, and that it requires some ritual. It requires ritual on our part. All of that feels like a big part of my work. And, when I think of it as an organizer, as a social justice person, one of the biggest pieces to me is like, we have whole systems that we want to bury, right? That we want to say the life cycle of capitalism is done, is dying, it's done. Like how do we actually start to recognize the signs in that system of perhaps dementia, right? How do we recognize the signs in that system that it's like, even for a system that is brutal, it's outdoing itself? And what does it look like to grieve a system that we still, in many ways, even among anti-capitalists, we rely on, we're hooked on, we participate in, we engage in, right? What does it mean to actually relinquish that system? And I think there's a lot of grief in that. I think there's anticipatory grief. I think people feel a lot of fear. It's like one thing to talk about the system falling. It's another thing to imagine someday that no one would deliver food to your house, or that you'd have to go back out to bartering in a collective space instead of being able to receive everything at home. And what does that mean in the age of virus? And there's all these really logical fears and things that we have to turn and face, just like we do when we're losing someone we love. We have to turn and face the truth of the letting go. I'm always arguing against binaries. This is good, this is bad. It's like, actually, the relinquishing of capitalism would be fantastic for future generations. And it'll be a challenge for the generations that actually have to do the transition. And we will be in that grief, right? And who's going to take the risk to move into it? So I think the better we get at grieving, the more possible it becomes that we can relinquish these systems that are killing us.
You had said on one of the interviews you did for the Griever's book that the evolution we need to make as a species is related to how we learn to grieve. Is that kind of what you're pointing to?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I really think that if we don't know how to let go, if we don't know how to honor, and we don't know how to ritualize, then everything builds up in our system and it's not taken care of. It's unattended to. I think so much of what we grieve is also people who didn't have time or space to attend to their well-being and their health. A lot of the losses that I've experienced have been people who I'm like, they should be here, like based on age and based on the lives that they'd lived, they should be here. But the stress, the weight of unprocessed grief is so heavy. And I think it keeps us not being able to face our grief and handle it well, but also not being able to face our mortality, I think keeps us in a naive phase of our humanity. Like, I think that it means we're like children who either are not aware that we might die, or in that adolescent phase where it's like, fuck it, I don't care. I'm going to do whatever. And there's something beyond that, the preciousness that comes with the maturity, which can happen at any age, but that preciousness of recognizing I'm going to die and everyone I love is going to die. And we have this limited time. And how do we make it abundant and beautiful and fertile? And how do we recognize that the way we are eternal is the intergenerational dance? So it's being in a relationship with our ancestors and with those who are to come. That would be such a beautiful way of both honoring. People have known this, people have always known this. And I think we're in a phase of forgetting. And I think capitalism is like a forgetting serum or something. It makes you forget where you come from and where you're going. It's just everything is about the immediacy and the what can you accumulate in the immediate moment. But I think if we drop into that older wisdom that I think is also ahead of us, right? There's something there that's like, our lives are not short if we think of ourselves in lineage. And if we see ourselves as doing work in lineage. And so then in my own life, I'm like, I'm moving along ideas that were passed to me, and I have to pass them along well, and ways of being. And grief, I think, is a big one of them.
Can you talk a little bit more about your relationship to ancestors and lineage, and like how you've progressed with your understand? I feel like I'm on the early stage. It's like I interviewed, do you know Tamira Cassette?
The name sounds familiar, but I'm not sure if I know.
She's also based in North Carolina and does ancestral healing work and collective healing, collective trauma work. But she's a big fan of yours.
Okay, we're going to connect.
Yeah, I'll connect you. It's sort of up for me, and I feel like it's up for many people around what does it mean, and like how do we start to relate to ancestors and our lineage more? I'm not sure if you could explain any of your own understanding of like what that looks like for you.
Well, yeah. I mean, I often quote my comrade Carla Perez, who works with Movement Generation, because there was a moment I was in a Movement Generation training, and she'd given a piece of wisdom teaching around Indigenous lineage, Indigenous histories of knowing. And I asked a question. I can't remember the exact question now, but it was basically like, what about those of us who are not still in touch with our ancestors or our lineage? We don't know that. We've been displaced. And she said, that displacement is part of your Indigenous story. And when she said that, something in me, cracked open. It took a while to just even feel and process into that. But it meant to me that I could begin to listen for and reach for even those stories of displacement in a different way, that I don't have to feel like all is lost. It's like, just because the stories were not written down doesn't mean they weren't lived and didn't happen. And so I began to really pay attention to narratives, look for stories of what were the experiences on these slave ships, and not to turn away from that, but to be like, well, that is, as far as I can tell, that is a major part of the lineage of my direct Adrienne's people, And then I started to give myself permission to also identify lineages of my work, lineages of inspiration for myself. So, and maybe that's one of the benefits of that displacement is that you get to look around and realize I have so many grandmothers and so many great grandmothers, so many great grandfathers, so many people who, because of the way that they lived, I'm more free, and they shaped conditions in which I could have access to more creativity, more space, more rest, more agency, more community in which to organize. So I have my ancestor wall, my ancestor altar, both has, my grandmother, my family, folks that I've lost, but it also has people that I have identified as like my ancestors as well. So Audre Lorde is there, James Baldwin is there, Octavia A. Butler obviously is there, Grace Lee Boggs is there, Toni Morrison, Malcolm X, Nina Simone, Maya Angelou, Prince, other people where I'm like, I wouldn't be who I am if it wasn't for them. They definitely are in the DNA of my thinking, the DNA of my creations. I think those are some ways, is to really notice who you look at historically that you're like, I am intentionally picking up that person's legacy and carrying it forward. I also think this helps. I think of it as an anti-capitalist time travel move as well, because capitalism is always trying to be like, you created some brand new idea and like it should be named for you and you should get awards and money for the thing you did. And this practice goes against that completely. It's like, there's nothing new. The thing that is new is the conglomeration of it all in my being and in my moment of time. But all of these ideas people have been wrestling with and thinking about and trying out and experimenting with and reaching for each other in. And now we have the technological advances, which again, were dreamed of. And then, now we get to have some manifestation of them. But to me, that feels really exciting to be like, I can go back and cite these people who've been in this lineage. And I don't know if this would excite all the listeners, but I always find it really exciting when I think I'm having a new idea. And then I go and read something and I'm like, oh, Grace, you thought about this 50 years ago? That happens to me so often where I'll go back and, I was like, Marx was not playing. Like there's some serious thinking that was going on. And I also like to imagine that my enslaved ancestors who did not have the capacity to write things down were also equally philosophical. And we're thinking about humanity and thinking about the stars and thinking about our place in things and thinking about what that weight of oppression meant and what it might be like to have it lifted. I can't even imagine, for me as a writer, the pain, the idea of like not being able to write my thoughts down and claim them. It's one of amongst all the pains of enslavement, that's one of the biggest ones for me. And so that also becomes part of my ancestor work as being like, just because you were not in a place where you were allowed to write that down, I'm going to still open the way for it that you to have been having those thoughts and maybe for me to hear them. And I try to do my writing from that place that I'm partnering with ancestors as much as I am hearing the poetry of nature or hearing the poetry of my own observations.
And it strikes me that your comment earlier about lighting the candle and thinking that the person who's passed is actually maybe not sad and they're actually in a better place. It strikes me that your rooting in that work gives you insight to that. And I think it's true.
Yeah. Especially I will say that as a 43-year-old, I'm in pain every day. And some of that is of my own making, decisions I've made that have accumulated in my body, parties that I partied at and different things like that. But some of it is also just aging. And I'm like, oh, aging is not a game. And I remember someone telling me when I was like 32, they were like, okay, after 35, it's all deterioration and just be ready for that. Now, as my body does shift and change, and I look at those who are older and older and older than me, and I see like everyone's moving from this perceived ability to the much more common experience of disability that is aging. And even just that way, I'm like, whatever happens when this spirit of mine leaves the body, I will not be in pain. That much I'm like, oh, or there might be some other kind of new pain that I can't even imagine. But just that piece of it that I'm like, the body that carries my pain for me, the body that accumulates that grief for me, the body that's carrying so much, that I will leave. And I know that for sure because I have been with bodies of people that I loved and I felt their absence from that body. And I'm like, I know that there was a you. If you are still in this body forever, I think I would be able to sense that, but you're not here. And so then that feels good. I'm just like, thank God you're not here laying here dead. Something has gone on. And for me, that always feels like a really profound recognition. One day I will not be in this body. And that means I won't have this lower back pain. My knees won't be in pain. Like, what could I think if I wasn't in pain all the time? What could I work? Maybe that's how I travel to Saturn as a spirit body. Who knows? So I like the idea of there being some possibilities in it for adventure. I also know that I feel the presence of my ancestors in a way that feels very distinct and it doesn't feel like a general ancestral like it feels like that's my grandmother, Eloise. She is really, it's a particular distinct energy impression. And so that is also really curious to me because I'm like, is that of my own imagining? Is that my grandmother Eloise regathering her unique personality self enough to imprint something across time and space to me? Like, what is that? And I do think that lighting the candles in some way lets people know there's still someone back here who cares about you and who has a sense of you as a distinction. And so maybe you go into the all and you come back out and you go in, who knows? But I like the idea of honoring the mystery of it all, and that you can love something that is mysterious.
for me, this connection between ancestral and being rooted, it also makes me think about future visioning. And I know you're deeply steeped in, Afrofuturism, Octavia Butler, you mentioned. One of the things I wanted to ask you is, it seems like there could be an opportunity for a clear, compelling future vision that is not sort of broad, that everyone has their needs met, but is actually more specific. Like reparations have been given, indigenous rights and land have been restored. Worker cooperatives are now the dominant economic model, and actually fleshing out the vision in a lot of detail rather than just directionally. And since you're so steeped in that work, I've been doing some collaborative work, some other people sort of co-creating what a vision might look like. But do you already know if that exists or if there's examples of that?
I mean, I think this is part of why I write science fiction and speculative fiction and visionary fiction, because I actually think a lot of people have written it into those kinds of texts. So I feel like, there's aspects of Octavia E. Butler's Acorn that have that. There's aspects of Starhawk's The Fifth Sacred Thing that have that. There's aspects of, I think it's 2132 by Kim Stanley Robinson that have pieces of this. I think that a lot of people have written portions of it. I think that there's a lot in Nnedi Okorafor's Binti trilogy that when I read that, there are pieces of it that I'm like, you're really figuring some stuff out here. It's really fascinating. And I think in all of them, you can feel the writer approaching their own horizon of imagination. And so to me, I think that's a really cool thing to be like, oh, right. We're imagining, as far out as we can. And even, even there's gender or whatever. And I'm like, okay, well, you can see our limitation, because when I imagine, I'm like, I think that we'll have abolished a lot of the constructs that we currently take for granted as our identities in those future visions. And that'll be a component of why we're able to experience the abundance, that I think is coming to us. Because Octavia E. Butler said our fatal flaw is the combination of hierarchy and intelligence. Those constructs are a fundamental aspect of upholding hierarchy. So yeah, I think that people have been writing them. I also think that they're written in the strategic plans and visions of a lot of organizations. And I think there's a lot of I would love sometime to have just tons and tons of groups come together for a massive vision exchange, right? Where everyone just said, here's our vision, here's our vision, here's our vision, here's our vision. And we got to look at all of these different people's coming together and being where do they align? And are there distinctions that we actually need to understand that might lead to, we need to be in different geographies or other things for some of these pieces of vision to happen. But yeah, I think there's a lot of visions. And I think one of the things that intrigues me is that moment where vision becomes framework. This is, again, part of why I talk about movement generation all the time, is I feel like they're one of the groups for me that does that work, where they're like, oh, we can see what is most likely going to happen based on how things have been going. We can articulate what we want and what our ancestors want, that way that what our ancestors wanted can flow through us towards a future that would be viable. And here's a framework then that allows us to talk about that with people who may not be comfortable in the context of vision. But yeah, I definitely see that. And that's also one of the things that I want to write, so grievers in some way. And I think by the end of the third trilogy, a lot will be in there. A lot will be shared in there. That's a lot of my vision is pouring out of me into that space. But I want a lot of people who do movement work to be writing more fiction. I'd love to see that be something that people, once you kind of moved through the realms, you're like, I've done all the different movement jobs and, I can't necessarily do the frontline work in the same way anymore. I would love to see those folks sit down and all write novels and novellas and tell us because I think there's a certain perspective that you get 20 years into movement, 30, 40, 50 years into movement. I think there's perspective on what humans are capable of, and then what are the underlying, not even underlying, in the brain, what are the deep, deep neural pathways that actually need to shift and change and be rerouted in order for something else to emerge for our species. So yeah, that's one of my dreams. And whenever I hear, I get lots of little secrety texts from people who are like, I wrote a short story. I wrote it. I'm writing something. And I just am so encouraging of that because I'm like, it's also healing coming up against this system every day and feeling how violently it resists that touch of the visionary and the love-based. And, it is so healing to actually be able to create a world that responds positively to those things and to see the distinctions, to see what it feels like to be my protagonists are all young Black women. It's like, what does it feel like to be a young Black woman in that condition? It's healing. It heals me every time.
I love that. And it sort of is so against my cultural conditioning of like, write nonfiction, be productive,
Same. There's a reason why I've got 5 nonfiction books out, when I'm finally getting a little fiction novella, it feels much more still legitimate to me to be writing essays and even interviewing people and writing theory, philosophy. But I think one of the tricks of it too is when you look at an Audre Lorde, like a Zami, or you look at what Octavia Butler offered us with the parables or other things, they're full of philosophy. They're full of theory. They're full of case studies. They're full of like how. The answer to that how is all throughout those texts. So I also think writing in that way, when I'm thinking like emergent strategy is in so many texts. And maybe that's a whole nother project to just go through and sort of track like what does emergent strategy fiction, that's already in the world look like. But I get excited about that I'm like, they're actually not necessarily distinct in terms of the way you're thinking in your mind. It's more distinct in terms of how you're presenting the information. I love storytelling is one of the oldest things we can remember or have evidence that we've been doing as a species. It's a core technology to how we function. So there's something about nonfiction that almost takes it away from the personal sometimes. And then I find as I'm writing the fiction, I'm like, this is so personal. I have to go into a character to write a character, which means I have to relinquish that binary me, you, I am, and there's something else. It's like, no, I'm able to get into every single one of these worldviews and these perspectives. And we need more of that. We do need more of that. I had forgotten that. I recently watched a documentary called Since I've Been Down by Gilda Shepherd, which we're hoping gets out into the world in a large way soon. It's an abolition film about folks who've been incarcerated. And it made me rethink what was possible again about humans because it told the stories of some people who are doing work. And it's true. They're true stories, but it almost feels like fiction because it's so fantastical what they're pulling off. And I'm like, we need to tell stories like that.
And I'm wondering in the last couple minutes, one of the questions we like to ask is, what do you need right now? And how can the listeners help you grow this next economy?
I love that. I need, what do I need right now?
Everyone should buy Grievers. Shout out AK Press.
I was going to say, I need people to just like read this fiction with me and like be in this visionary conversation. But I think there's also something around like, I need to know that people have a faith that's larger than their knee-jerk reactions. I think the next economy is one that will come from our ability to be in experiments where we make mistakes. And currently, the landscape for making mistakes feels like a minefield. And I think that the landscape for making mistakes should feel more like a really dope ocean or like a beach with a cool ocean and some mountains behind it. And it's like, yeah, I made a mistake and rolled back down the mountain right into the ocean. It was awesome. I'm like, how do we make it feel good and part of a community? When you're making mistakes, that's like a way that you're actually deepening into community because you're letting people see your imperfection, which is your humanity, which is what we actually are. So I think that's the thing I need is for more people to be like, it's okay for me to make mistakes and I can make a lot of room for other people's mistakes. And we can develop that accountability culture that allows us to actually be experimental in right relationship.
I love it.
That's what I need.
Yeah. And I mean, you have a book, We Will Not Cancel Us, around some of those pieces. And I just bought it hasn't come yet from AK, but the one about social justice facilitation, holding change. So I'm excited for that.
Oh yeah. Holding change. I'm excited for that one too. That one has been it's much quieter experience as a book, but I'm getting such great feedback from people who want to be facilitators that they're like, oh, yes. So I'm like, good, great. Yeah, thank you.
And where can folks learn more about your work? So if you want to shout out any socials akpress.org is the main place to go. All the books are there. And I think they've made maybe a little bundle or something. So you can just kind of cop it together. And then Instagram is my main place where I do social media things. So there is Adrienne Maree Brown on Instagram. And I've been really playing a lot with meme curation and just kind of finding things that bring me joy. I think memes can bring you joy and also touch into places of quite some depth. So I've been really enjoying that. So if you want a little fun with memes and other things, you can find me there. Well, thank you so much, Adrienne. And I did want to say that I think one of the reasons I was excited to interview you is you have a gift that very few writers in my experience really have around this ability to weave together different threads, somatic, ancestral, communal, identity, and translate them into something that makes us more whole. And so I just really want to appreciate you and say thank you for everything you're doing, because I see you and I honor what you're doing.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I really draw on the wisdom of spiders and octopus and other things that are at least 8-legged. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. Before you go, we wanted to let you know that our spring cohort of the Next Economy MBA begins on March 26th. If you're an entrepreneur seeking to create a business that works for all life, a member of a team looking to transition your organization into one that is more regenerative and democratic, or someone who's considering a career or livelihood transition and embodiment with your values, we designed this course for you. Over this 9-month learning journey, you'll have the chance to learn practical skills around business and life design based on our work with over 250 social enterprises. In addition to live sessions, you can deepen your experience and practice with special sessions, affinity groups, and connections with over 500 alumni who have participated in the course. Interested in learning more? Visit lifteconomy.com/MBA to view our course curriculum and sign up for a free intro with one of our facilitators. If you're ready to sign up, you can use the code PODCASTMBA to save 10% on tuition. We hope you'll join us.